Okay, here's a question for you. What could the explosive power of a world-class sprinter possibly have to do with the simple, fluffy rise of a fresh loaf of bread? I know, it sounds like a total riddle, but the answer is this amazing biological process called anaerobic respiration. Today, we're going to uncover that hidden connection. So let's just lay it all out there. What in the world do a 100-meter sprint and a loaf of bread actually have in common? I mean, on one hand, you have the absolute peak of human performance, and on the other, you've got a kitchen staple. Well, it turns out they share a pretty cool biological secret. And that secret, the thing that connects our athlete and our baker, it's basically an emergency power mode. It's a process that both human muscle cells and these tiny little yeast cells use when they are pushed to their absolute limit. But before we can really solve that mystery, we kind of have to take one step back. We need to get a handle on a really fundamental idea: how all living things, from us to a single-celled yeast, get their energy. It's like looking under the hood at life's energy engine. So that engine is called respiration. And let's be super clear about something right away. This is a chemical reaction that's happening inside every single living cell to get energy from sugar, from glucose. It is absolutely not the same thing as breathing. Think of it like this. Breathing gets the oxygen in the door, but respiration is the chemical magic that actually uses it to power, well, everything. So to keep things simple, just think of respiration in two ways. You've got your everyday marathon mode. That's what our bodies are doing most of the time. And then you've got the emergency sprint mode, the one that kicks in when things get really intense. And this breaks it down perfectly. On the left, we've got aerobic respiration. That's our marathon mode. It needs oxygen, and man, it releases a ton of energy. It's what your cells are doing right now just listening to this. But on the right, that's anaerobic respiration, our sprint mode. And this is the key to our whole mystery. It needs zero oxygen. Now, it releases less energy, but, and this is crucial, it does it incredibly fast. It is the ultimate emergency backup plan. So let's dive into our first case study, the sprinter. What is actually going on inside their muscles that causes that, that famous burn? Let's just walk through the story of a sprint. The race starts, the sprinter just explodes out of the blocks. Their muscles are screaming for energy, but there's a problem. Their heart and lungs just can't get oxygen to them fast enough. So what happens? The muscles flip the switch to their emergency backup, anaerobic respiration. This gives them that vital, super quick burst of energy, but it comes with a price. A byproduct gets made called lactic acid. And as that lactic acid builds up, that's where you get that muscle burn and fatigue. So when it comes right down to it, the whole thing boils down to this really simple equation. Inside our muscles, when there isn't enough oxygen to go around, glucose gets turned straight into lactic acid. That's the trade-off, right? You get that burst of speed, but you also get the burn. And you know that feeling after a really hard run, where you're just gasping for air? Well, that's your body paying back what's called an oxygen debt. All that heavy breathing is just your body grabbing all the extra oxygen it can to break down that lactic acid and get everything back to normal. Okay, so that's the sprinter's side of things. Now let's completely switch gears. We're leaving the running track and we're heading straight into the bakery to see how this exact same process works in what's basically a fermentation factory. Now, when this happens in microorganisms like yeast, it gets a special name, fermentation. But really, at its core, it's the exact same idea. It's just their version of anaerobic respiration, a way for them to get energy from glucose when there's no oxygen around. Okay, but here is where the story gets really, really cool. Check out the equation for yeast. It also starts with glucose, just like we did, but instead of making lactic acid, it makes two totally different things: ethanol, which is a type of alcohol, and carbon dioxide gas. And it just so happens, those two things are incredibly useful for us. This table just sums it all up so nicely. For us humans, it's glucose turning into lactic acid, all for that quick burst of speed. For yeast, it's glucose turning into ethanol and carbon dioxide, which, as it turns out, is perfect for making bread and beer. It's the exact same biological principle, surviving without oxygen, that leads to two completely different but really important results. All right, let's bring it all home. We've talked about the muscle, now let's connect it all the way to the muffins and finally solve our puzzle. So what do a sprint and a loaf of bread have in common? The answer is anaerobic respiration. It's that simple. Both the sprinter's muscles and the baker's yeast are in a situation where they need energy, and they need it fast, without enough oxygen. So they both flip on the exact same emergency process. They just get different results. The sprinter gets lactic acid and that muscle burn. The baker gets carbon dioxide gas, and that is what creates all the little air pockets that make bread so light and fluffy. But this brings up a pretty good question, right? If the yeast is making ethanol, alcohol, right there in the dough, why don't we get a little buzz from eating a sandwich? And the answer is just wonderfully simple. The heat. When you put the bread in a hot oven, all of that alcohol just evaporates away, leaving behind delicious, perfectly fluffy, and completely alcohol-free bread. There's this line in our source material that I just love. It says, if you get a piece of bread with a huge bubble in it, I like to think that's where really enthusiastic yeast was doing its stuff. And that's such a perfect way to picture it, isn't it? Every little air bubble is just a sign that some tiny organisms were working really hard, making our bread perfect. So, from an Olympic final all the way to your breakfast toast, anaerobic respiration is this powerful, hidden force. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other amazing bits of science are secretly powering your day? That's all for this explainer. Stay curious.